5 Ps, a framework published by Henry Mintzberg in 1987 that most strategy practitioners have heard of, and almost none have applied with any rigor. 5 words that sit behind every investor day presentation, every board strategy day, and every corporate narrative about transformation, doing precisely nothing, because the people in the room are using one of the 5 definitions and calling it the only one: plan, ploy, pattern, position, perspective. Mintzberg's argument is that strategy is not one thing. It is 5 things, each separately real, each separately observable, and each separately capable of being in conflict with the others. The framework's value is not the vocabulary. The vocabulary is a means to an end. The framework's value is the discipline of asking, for your own organization, which of these 5 strategies you are actually running, and whether the 5 are aligned. Because when they are not aligned, when the plan says one thing, the pattern says another, and the perspective says a third, you do not have a strategy. You have a story you are telling yourself and a set of behaviors that will eventually contradict it in public. Origin, 1987. Henry Mintzberg, at McGill University, publishes 2 papers back-to-back in the California Management Review: The Strategy Concept, Why, 5 Ps for Strategy, and The Strategy Concept 2, another look at why organizations need strategy. The first paper is the definitional one. Mintzberg's provocation is that the field of strategic management had spent 20 years producing frameworks without settling the prior question of what strategy actually is. His answer: it is 5 things, and the tension between them is not a problem to be resolved. It is a condition to be managed. The framework has outlived every subsequent theory of competitive advantage because it asks the question that comes before all the others. Before you deploy a strategy, can you say what kind of thing you are deploying? Here is the case: BP plc. In the year 2000, Lord John Browne, then Group Chief Executive, rebrands the company. British Petroleum becomes Beyond Petroleum. The sunflower logo replaces the shield. BP makes capital commitments to solar and wind energy, stakes a public claim to being a responsible energy company for the 21st century, and tells investors, governments, and the public that it is repositioning itself for what comes after hydrocarbons. The brand campaign wins awards. The Financial Times covers it as a genuine strategic pivot. Environmental organizations describe it briefly as a model for the sector. Lord Browne tells Davos that the age of the carbon company is ending, and that BP intends to lead what comes next. What makes this a Mintzberg case is that every one of the 5 Ps was, at that moment, telling a different story. Take them in turn. Plan. A plan, in Mintzberg's definition, is a consciously intended course of action, formulated in advance, with a clear direction. The Beyond Petroleum strategy was a plan. It was articulated by the chief executive, communicated to capital markets and to the public, embedded in branding, and backed by stated commitments to renewable energy investment. The plan existed. It was explicit. It was signed at the top of the house. A Mintzberg-aware strategist would have asked, what does this plan require the organization to change about itself in order to remain credible over a 10-year horizon? And is the capital allocation that follows this announcement consistent with that requirement? That question was not asked with the rigor it required. Ploy. A ploy, in Mintzberg's definition, is a specific maneuver intended to outwit a competitor, or in a regulated context to preempt a regulator or manage a political relationship. The Beyond Petroleum rebranding had the structure of a ploy. The European Union was, in 2000, beginning the consultation process that would lead to the EU emissions trading system. The Kyoto Protocol had been signed in 1997 and was moving toward ratification. The political and regulatory environment for carbon-intensive industry was shifting in a direction that companies like BP had strong incentives to get ahead of. The rebranding gave BP a defensible position with governments and regulators before the regulatory architecture hardened. That is not cynicism. That is the ploy dimension of strategy, used deliberately. A Mintzberg-aware strategist would have asked, if this ploy succeeds and regulators treat us as a good faith actor, what obligations does that political relationship impose on us going forward, and are we prepared to honor them? The answer, over the following decade, turned out to be no. Pattern. Pattern, in Mintzberg's definition, is strategy as observed in retrospect, consistency in behaviour over time, whether intended or not. A pattern is what the organisation actually does, stripped of what it says it does. Between 2000 and 2010, while the plan said beyond Petroleum and the Ploy had positioned BP as a responsible energy company, the pattern said something else. Capital expenditure on renewable energy remained a marginal proportion of total annual capital expenditure through the 2000s. Safety investment at legacy oil facilities was cut. Texas City Refinery in Texas had been the subject of internal safety warnings for years before the 15th of March 2005, when an explosion killed 15 workers and injured a further 180. The Baker Panel report, commissioned by BP itself and published in January 2007, found a pattern of PRO-CES safety failures that were organisational in origin, not individual. Cost reduction was being applied systematically to the assets that required sustained capital commitment to remain safe. The pattern in Mintzberg's sense was visible by 2006 to anyone willing to look at capital allocation and safety data rather than brand advertising. A Mintzberg-aware strategist would have asked, does our observed pattern of capital allocation over the last 5 years match the strategy we say we are pursuing? The answer would have been no. In 4 years, it became undeniable. Position. Position, in Mintzberg's definition, is strategy as the location of the organisation in relation to its environment, its competitive niche, its relationship with customers, governments and regulators, the ground it has chosen to hold. BP's intended position was the energy major that had moved first on climate. That position was commercially valuable and politically useful. It was also fragile. A position built on a claim, we are the responsible energy company, is only as durable as the evidence that supports it. On the 20th of April 2010, the Macondo well on the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig blew out in the Gulf of Mexico. 11 workers died. The well discharged approximately 4.9 million barrels of crude oil into the Gulf over the following 87 days. It was the largest marine oil spill in United States history. The position BP had built over 10 years, responsible, forward-thinking, climate-aware, collapsed in 11 weeks. A Mintzberg-aware strategist would have asked, is the position we are claiming sustainable if the underlying pattern does not support it? The answer in 2010 was given by the Gulf of Mexico. Perspective. Perspective, in Mintzberg's definition, is the most fundamental of the 5. It is not what the organisation says it does, or even what it does. It is the organisation's ingrained way of perceiving itself and its world, the mental model that determines which information is registered, which is filtered out, and which decisions feel natural and which feel foreign. An organisation's perspective is the substrate from which all other strategy flows. BP's perspective, regardless of the branding, remained the perspective of a hydrocarbon extraction company. That perspective meant that decisions which looked risky through a climate or safety lens looked normal from inside the organisation, because the reference point was the geology of the next well, the economics of the next lease, the regulatory requirements of the next jurisdiction. The perspective had not changed. The plan, the ploy, and the position all described a different organisation. The pattern and the perspective described the one that actually existed. When the perspective and the plan are in conflict, and no one has done the work to align them, the perspective wins. Always. A Mintzberg-aware non-executive director would have asked, can we produce evidence that the organisation's mental model of itself has changed? Or have we changed the language without changing the model? The answer in BP's case was the second. 5 dimensions, 5 separate signals that the plan and the perspective were not aligned, that the pattern was running independently of both, and that the position was built on a claim the organisation could not sustain. The framework, applied with rigour by a board in 2005, would have made visible a gap that was already producing harm. Here is the strategist's objection. Mintzberg's 5 Ps are too abstract to be useful. They describe what strategy is, not how to build one. The objection has merit at the level of operational planning. It has no merit at the level of board governance. A board's job is not to build the operating plan. It is to test whether the operating plan, as presented, is consistent with the organisation's actual behaviour, actual capabilities, and actual environmental position. Mintzberg's 5 Ps give a non-executive director 5 separate tests to apply to any strategy presented in the boardroom. Is the plan credible? Does the ploy impose obligations the organization is prepared to meet? Does the observed pattern support or contradict the plan? Does the position rest on claims the organization can sustain? Has the perspective actually changed? Or has the language changed and the model remained? Those 5 questions applied systematically would have produced a different outcome at BP. The positive contrast, Patagonia, founded in 1973 by Yvon Chouinard as an outdoor clothing and equipment company. Patagonia's perspective from the first decade was unusual for a commercial enterprise. The business exists as a tool for environmental activism. That perspective is not a marketing claim. It is the founding logic of the organization, stated by the founder, repeated in every strategic document, and critically, visible in every pattern the company has produced over 50 years. Patagonia has committed 1% of revenues to environmental causes every year since 1985, regardless of profitability. In 2011, on Black Friday, it ran a full-page advertisement in the New York Times that said, "In terms, don't buy this jacket." The advertisement told customers not to purchase a Patagonia jacket unless they needed one, on environmental grounds. It was a commercial risk taken because the perspective required it. In September 2022, Chouinard transferred ownership of Patagonia to a purpose trust and a non-profit organization dedicated to environmental causes. The Earth, in his phrase, is now Patagonia's only shareholder. The position, outdoor gear for environmentally committed consumers, is authentic because the pattern has supported it for 5 decades. The plan at each stage is credible because the perspective has not changed. Patagonia is, in Mintzberg's terms, a 5P aligned organization. The 5 dimensions of its strategy say the same thing. It is, as a result, immune to the specific failure mode that destroyed BP's position. You cannot be accused of greenwashing when the pattern has been consistent for 50 years. The pattern across the 2 cases is the same in opposite directions. Mintzberg's framework was available to BP's board in 2000. It is available to every board in every sector today. The question it poses is not complicated. It is uncomfortable. Do the 5 dimensions of our strategy align? If they do not, the gap between them is not a communication problem or a branding problem. It is a governance problem. And governance problems that are not surfaced in the boardroom are surfaced elsewhere. 3 things to carry forward. Reading. Mintzberg's 1987 paper, The Strategy Concept, and 5 Ps for Strategy, published in the California Management Review, Volume 30, Number 1. For the BP record, the Baker Panel Report, formerly the report of the BP US Refineries Independent Safety Review Panel, published January 2007. And the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill and Offshore Drilling Final Report, Deep Water, the Gulf Oil Disaster and the Future of Offshore Drilling, published January 2011. A question. In your last board strategy session, how many of Mintzberg's 5 Ps were explicitly tested? If the answer is 1, the plan, that is the standard answer. The 4 you did not test are the 4 that will tell you something the plan cannot. And the wider library, Mintzberg tells you what kind of thing your strategy is. PESTLE tells you what in the external environment your strategy must navigate. Mendelow tells you whose power and interest shapes the space in which you operate. 3 frameworks, 1 integrated discipline. Mintzberg gives you the anatomy, PESTLE gives you the terrain, Mendelow gives you the actors. Curated by Matthew Doyle, Made Partners.